my involvement with everything that sort of Tony, Pete, and Tim are going to talk about, kind of from high level down to on the ground implementation, was really Tony wanted some trees for a project. And well, actually, I guess there's been two projects. So through my involvement with the U.S. Forest Service and sort of some research that we do together, we were able to provide chestnut material for the ASCC project in the northern New Hampshire that the Pete worked on primarily. So I'm just gonna like scoop everyone's stuff right now. So we were, kind of tangentially involved with that by providing material and chestnut guidance, and I've had a few interns go up there to help plant and measure. And then Tim also wanted to implement a project on his property that Tony kind of helped implement. And so again, we were able to provide the trees and some planting guidance for that and support these efforts through just providing chestnut as a piece, as one species to look at in sort of this broader context of how do we manage forests in the face of climate change. So they know a lot more about it than I do. I just think it's great that chestnut's been a part of it. And I'm really excited for you guys to hear about it, because I think especially the work that Tim's been doing really highlights things that you can do. Climate change seems like this big, horrible, like nebulous thing to wrap your arms around, and having some actual actionable things that you can do is kind of a point of hope, I think, for at least I think it is. So I'm going to shut up. Thanks, guys.
All right. Well, thanks, Kendra. That's a great scoop on everything. So no need to give the presentations, but no, thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of the group here with Pete and Tim, and really appreciate the partnership with American Chestnut Foundation on these different projects. So let me just share my screen here. So as Kendra mentioned, the goal for the session today is really to kind of start broadly. And so what I'm going to do is really talk a bit about just adaptive silviculture, so managing forests in ways that we hope are able to sustain many of the values that we care about from forests, but in the context of the changing environmental conditions we're facing now, as well as the increasing proliferation of invasive insects and pathogens. And so I'm largely going to keep it at kind of the broader level in terms of both like why are people concerned, and then what do we view as at least one way to address those concerns with different management approaches. And then I'll tee it up for Pete to take over and talk more about how American chestnut really has fit into this as part of one of the many tools we're trying to use to sustain forests into the future, with Tim wrapping things up by showing, as Kendra mentioned, how family forest owners are really engaging with their land and trying to address the challenges of climate change, again, using American chestnut and other species as ways to combat that. So here in the Northeast, I'll really be speaking from the context of what we're doing here in primarily northern New England and New York, but writ large, we think about our forests and kind of the era that we're now existing within. It's really a very novel time. If you were to ask folks in Vermont their opinion of the weather, it would be not enough snow, too much rain all at once. Asking about the forest, too many non-native insects, too many diseases, not enough regeneration, too many deer. All of these things really create a whole bundle of challenges that are making it hard for us to expect the forests that currently there are here today to keep functioning the same way into the future. And so are there other things that we need to be doing to adapt to those changes to sustain those values into the future? And so just to kind of drive that point home, we recently did a survey with Rachel Chapman, the University of Maine, and Pete was involved with this as well, interviewing and surveying over 330 foresters from the Northeast and Lake States region. It was a mix of urban and rural foresters. And so this bar graph is just showing rural foresters in dark green and then urban foresters in light green, and their level of concern with different things affecting the forest. So there's definitely divergence between rural and urban foresters in terms of what they're most concerned about, but they agree that the biggest concern, and this is pre-beech leaf disease screaming up the Northeast, and that really found throughout a lot of our forests, even before that, showing a lot of concern about what insects and diseases might do to the future, as well as changes in snowpack, competition, drought, heat stress, et cetera. And so collectively, our forest management community, certainly many forest landowners, and others that interact with the forest are concerned about climate change, concerned about changes in insects and diseases, and really are looking to do management on the ground that can actually adapt to those changes and try to sustain many of the values and services that we rely upon forests for. So what I'm going to do, and again, Pete and Tim will certainly show this in detail in terms of like implementation on the ground in relation to the work they're doing with American Chestnut. But I'm going to just give us a bit of a broad framing as to how we're thinking about adapting to change and the ways in which management, including the use of restoration of American Chestnut, might provide opportunities for us to still, sustain forest conditions into the future that again are really providing those key services like carbon storage and sequestration, habitat provisioning, wood, clean water, aesthetic beauty, all those things that we value from the forest that are greatly threatened by something like an introduced pathogen or extreme weather or climatic events. And so I'm going to be pretty theoretical and then kind of step it down a little bit to kind of point to where American chestnut fits in as we think about this in the context of our forests in the Northeast. So when we look at forest conditions across the landscape, one of the things we often are assessing is how vulnerable is that forest to change? Does it actually, have the potential to be severely impacted? And then if it is impacted, how might it respond to that change? And is that in a positive or negative way? And so I really like to use these figures, and I'll kind of go through them in a moment with a cartoon to talk this through. But what we're really looking at in a lot of our forests in the East Coast is we have very simplified forest conditions. I like these pictures on the left that are really the outgrowth of historic land use, as well as even ongoing land use that's focused primarily on kind of maximizing kind of uniform conditions over large areas. And so these have usually single age class of trees, often maybe one or two species, but aren't very complex when we think about it from an ecological standpoint. Whereas on the other hand, we know that through management and through natural processes, we can certainly create forests that are much more complex in terms of their species composition and structure. And so when we look at climate change and its impacts and what might happen to our forests, we know forests are going to change. Even if you are not fully on board with climate change, forests are going to change. They're dynamic, they evolve over time. And so when we're looking at the impacts of climate change and other things, we really want to focus in on what of those changes might still allow that forest to exist within the conditions that provide us what we need from the ecosystem, because it really is about our values and are those being sustained into the future. And so this diagram here kind of has this ellipse that I'm highlighting with the pointer here of the range of conditions in the forest that still provide us those values, whether they're ecological, cultural, social, economic, over time in that ecosystem. And so if that forest starts out as a simple ecosystem, so, all the same age, all the same species, so we're sitting here today, and it's impacted by something like a drought or a spongy moth outbreak or beech leaf disease, what we're concerned about is those simple forests responding to that change. Many of the pathways that forest will take over time actually go outside of that range of conditions that actually is providing us the goods and services we desire. And so there's very little what we consider adaptive capacity for that forest to absorb those disturbances and then stay within the realm of what we're looking for. And so what we're often talking about when it comes to adaptation actions are how can we actually, restore complexity to our forests? That includes restoring maybe lost species like American chestnut, or restoring diversity in age classes, as well as other species in the landscape. Because the idea being is that if we start with a forest that has many species, many structures, a lot of diversity to it, when that forest is impacted by an event, it's going to change, but many of those changes still kind of stay within the realm of what we view as acceptable from a societal perspective. And so a lot of what we're trying to do with adaptation is do things that provide these multiple mechanisms and pathways for that forest to respond. So what we tend to use for terminology around this, and Pete's going to refer back to this in his presentation, that there's a general framework of kind of options for how we might think about managing for climate change and what strategies we might take on the ground to do that. And so the first approach is that we might manage to resist change. And so one example might be anybody that pulls buckthorn, pulls honeysuckle, pulls garlic mustard, and is trying to resist that change to their forest. You're actually doing this practice. You're trying to kind of minimize these novel stressors from having an impact on that ecosystem. Likewise, we might thin the forest to increase the amount of resources those trees have to fight off, the impacts of drought or insects and diseases. Or we might even, treat individual trees with insecticides or fungicides. All of those strategies are really trying to keep that forest as it is today in the face of all these ongoing changes. And so I often view this as a strategy that over time certainly becomes much more labor and cost intensive. The next approach might be we're going to manage for resilience. And so instead of trying to kind of keep that forest the same, we acknowledge that forest is going to be impacted by climate change and disturbance. And so what we try to do is increase the ways in which that forest might be able to bounce back and recover from those disturbances and still maintain that functioning that we historically have associated with that ecosystem. And so really increasing the opportunities for that forest to recover and evolve in response to disturbance. And the final approach, and one that we'll certainly spend a bit of time on, particularly in Pete's presentation, is that we might manage for transition. And so instead of trying to keep that forest the same, or instead of trying to keep that forest within a range of kind of historical conditions that can kind of absorb disturbances and climate change impacts, we instead manage that forest for possible future conditions. And so try to anticipate what species, what structures might be better adapted to the changes we're currently seeing on the landscape. And so I often like to point out that as you move along this gradient, really our familiarity with how to do things from a management experience standpoint really goes down. There's really no guidebook for how to manage central hardwoods for the year 2050. We really rely so much on our past and current experience. And so there's a lot of need for us to be both through what Tim will demonstrate as a landowner, but also through what we do through research to try to go out and evaluate these more novel approaches to understand what may or may not be viable into the future. The last piece that's worth mentioning before I put this in the context of chestnut, and this is certainly relevant to it, is that I mentioned earlier, so much what we're trying to do when we're adapting to change is we recognize we can't keep the forests of 2024 the same, for the next 80 years. We likely will lose other species, and we likely will be seeing less abundance of certain species in an area due both to climate change stress, but also importantly, the impact of non-indigenous insects and pathogens. And so if we're trying to maintain those values and functions we currently have for the forests in 2024 into the year 2074, then we need to be looking at if we're going to lose a species or we're going to have less of a species, are there other species in that forest that might serve similar functions that could take the place of that species if it's lost? And so trying to still carry those values forward. And so it really changes the way we look at the forest beyond just a species by species perspective and more around are the different functions in that forest that we have redundancy with, which would then make them less at risk to being lost to change. So this diagram is a simple example. We have a deciduous forest mixed with a conifer forest. It's just two species, one deciduous tree, one conifer tree. So picture, hardwood hemlock forest. Hemlock's lost to hemlock woolly adelgid. We have no other tree in that forest to kind of take the place of hemlock. So it's a very vulnerable function. The contrast is forest on the bottom. We have multiple deciduous species. We have multiple coniferous species. So if any of those is lost either to climate change impacts or lost to an insect or disease, you still have other species that will replace that in terms of some of its functions. It doesn't replace the identity of that species, which can be important culturally and socially, but it certainly can maintain some of those ecological functions into the future. And so this idea of thinking about species and the functions they play has really led to us thinking about if we don't have a certain species or function that's redundant in the site, do we need to actually deliberately regenerate that species through planting or other approaches? So Pete's going to talk a lot more about assisted migration and ideas around reforestation in the context of climate change. But a lot of what we do in our work, and certainly Tim will showcase this as well on his property, is that when we're deciding how to manage for the future and we're choosing different species to plant and restore to an area or actually bring into an area that may not currently be there, one of the main things we're looking at is, are we bringing a species onto this site that will serve a similar ecological function to species currently present that might be lost to change? And so can we create that redundancy? Likewise, does this species potentially have similar values as it relates to foods or medicines or ceremonies or cultural lifeways that might be lost if another species is removed from the site? And then importantly, are we planting species that actually will be adapted to the future? So how does chestnut fit into this? So as Kendra mentioned, we do a lot of work, and I'll show a map of where our experiments are in the Northeast in a moment. But chestnut ends up being a species that we include a lot in our adaptation work. And there's some simple examples as to why that's a valuable species beyond just knowing it was an important part of our forest historically. And if we look at three current threats to eastern forests, the emerald ash borer on the left, threatening ash, beech leaf disease, threatening beech, spongy moth, seeming to have much higher virulence than I've witnessed before. We're actually seeing mortality after a single year of defoliation in some areas. So oak being threatened. American chestnut as a species, being able to restore that to a site really is filling some of the functions that ash as a fast growing, high wood density species holds. So if we want another tree species that can get large, that's growing at a fast rate and actually sequestering carbon and fixing carbon at much higher pounds per acre than most other species, given that wood density, then American chestnuts is really, really critical for those sites. Likewise, we all recognize the importance of American chestnut as a food source for animals. We're very concerned, particularly around beech, what the loss of that mast is going to mean, particularly for black bear populations. And so bringing in American chestnut is certainly would be a critical option for sustaining that function. And then finally, we also all recognize the importance of American chestnut as a traditional food. And so, when we lose other species like white oak from areas where it was historically gathered or currently gathered as a food source, providing that's really critical. And so much of why that's factoring into our work is that it does provide both an opportunity to experiment with chestnut restoration, but also for adaptation provides this key opportunity to fill the niche some of these species are sadly being lost from. So Pete will talk more about this, but just to acknowledge, it's been really wonderful to partner with Kendra and the American Chestnut Foundation. We have a lot of experiments that we've been establishing over the last 7 years in the Northeast that co-produce large-scale adaptation actions on the ground to test out, what may or may not work for sustaining forests in the Northeast over time. And again, American chestnut restoration is a big part of many of these sites, just given we view this as a species that has a lot of potential for sustaining those values. And again, Pete will talk more about that in a second. So just to kind of end the kind of broader portion here, we really are seeing, and I think all of you, even the term, I don't have it in my slides, but climate smart this, climate smart that. It's amazing over the last several years, just like how much more emphasis is being placed on managing proactively and thinking about how can we adapt forests, particularly to sustain those values and benefits that we care about in the future. And as I mentioned, American chestnut is a species, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but really does provide many functions and values that are both unique, but also importantly redundant with other species that are currently threatened. And so it's a real important tool for increasing capacity into the future to deal with those changes. So we're going to dig in a bit further as to what we're seeing by actually trying to restore that in the landscape, but hopefully that was a useful kind of overview of at least just some of how we're conceptualizing adaptation. So Pete, I'll pass the baton to you. I'll stop sharing here.
Thanks, Tony. That was great. I work with Tony on a pretty regular basis, but even seeing this presentation again, it's always a reminder of the complexities of the landscape and the forest that we manage. So thanks, Tony, for teeing that up. So I think where my role is we're taking a little bit of a deeper dive and thinking about some of the experimentation that we're doing in terms of climate adaptation and really framing this within restoring a keystone species, American chestnut, into the future. And so thinking about some of our work around assisted migration and climate adaptation. And so, of course, my name is on this slide, but many credits to Tony D'Amato, who's helped conceive and build out much of this work, as well as Kendra, who's on the call, and a number of other folks who have helped implement and conceive and develop this work. And so just to set the stage and harken back to a concept that Tony mentioned, we have this spectrum of adaptation options: resisting, promoting resilience, or potentially transitioning ecosystems to be maybe a bit more future climate adapted in terms of climate change vulnerabilities, shifting species ranges. And so today I'll be largely focused on this idea of transitioning ecosystems. Can we use forest management actions that can potentially promote a future climate adapted state in our forests? And so I've highlighted that in the slide here. But one of the tools that we use when we think about transitioning ecosystems, well, there are aspects of maybe modifying the structure of a forest. In the northeastern region, we're oftentimes thinking about that species level, or even that genetic level in terms of that seed source where species are coming from. And so there's really been quite a bit of momentum of tree planting for adaptation for various objectives. Certainly quite a bit of emphasis on the carbon mitigation potential of tree planting. There are big ambitious initiatives like Plant a Billion Trees out there, which in the northeastern region highlight the potential for many, many millions of acres, necessitating many, many billions of trees. We'll see how that opportunity actually manifests. As Tony mentioned, this idea of assisted migration in the Northeast is actually a pretty unique region where, based on some of our climate models, we expect that this to be a bit of a hotbed in terms of potentially new habitat for species that are not present on site. And so how do we incorporate this idea of assisted migration into sustainable forest management into the future? And then potentially restoring species, American chestnut being one of them, of course, as well as elm, spruce, other keystone species, while simultaneously thinking about that idea of functional redundancy that Tony mentioned. As we think about potentially losing some species, can we incorporate plantings to perhaps replace those that are in decline or threatened? And so these are some of the general food groups that we think about for tree planting for adaptation, as opposed to purely reforestation. And so I'll be taking a little bit of a deeper dive into this idea of assisted migration. And really the underlying thinking behind this is that plant dispersal rates, at least historic dispersal rates, really do not equal the pace of climate change. So we recognize that over long time periods, we're talking tens of thousands of years, historical tree dispersal rates, at least here in New England, species have moved on the order of a tenth to around a third of a mile annually, comparing that to the rate of climate change is around 4 to 6 miles a year. And so really the main takeaway here is that climate change far exceeds the natural dispersal rates of plants and tree species to be able to migrate and keep pace. And so over time, what we would expect to see is a climate species mismatch, and those local species will and genotypes will eventually become maladapted to the sites that they're out there. These are sessile organisms, and without that movement, we may end up seeing a tipping point in terms of their vulnerability. And so we looked at tools like the USDA Forest Service Climate Change Tree Atlas, and we can recognize that using current presence and habitat, we can model species shifts under different climate change emission scenarios. And one of the complications with American chestnut, we recognize its historic range, but given its current distribution, and what we're looking at here on the left side of your screen, these populations are generally pretty disparate, so it's hard to use that to impute a model in terms of its potential northward movement in terms of shifting species habitat. But we do recognize that there are analogous species, and by common inference, we can recognize that there's likely potential movement in terms of increasing habitat, especially as we start moving more north. And so just an example here, I'm just looking at modeled current habitat of northern red oak relative to under a high emission scenario. We expect that habitat to increase. Now that there are other species that we can use in examples where we expect to see decreases, but just getting us thinking about species are projected to move under warming conditions. And so there are species that are expected to increase and potentially decrease. And I am talking about species, but we can also think about this in terms of that seed source where the individual genotypes are adapted to. And so using seed collection tools under different simulation models, just an example here, over the next 50 to 100 years, under a low emission scenario, looking at a site in central New Hampshire, Vermont border, we may start looking at collecting seeds for that site, maybe not from that localized seed source, but in terms of climate adapted sources that are maybe be a bit more southern, even down to southern New England, parts of Pennsylvania. And then under a high emission scenario, you can see that those seed sources may actually move a bit farther south. And so starting to think about if we're planting for the future and we want those healthy forests, perhaps collecting seeds from maybe a more southern region to plant for a future climate scenario. And so this brings us to this idea of assisted migration in forestry. And there are different food groups that we talk about and think about the movement of genotypes and species. And so I'll just walk through some of the thinking behind that. And so the first type of assisted migration that we refer to as assisted population enrichment. And so this is something that we've generally used in forestry over the last many decades, typically moving genotypes of a species within its continuous range. Here, the definition is the movement of species or genotypes relatively short distances, but within the expansion of the contiguous and current distribution. So maybe a southern genotype along it of that species up to its northern range margins, but still within its historic range. Thinking about that movement of seed source. Second option, we refer to as assisted range expansion. So this is the movement of populations to locations adjacent to the current species range from an area where that climate is similar to where it's projected to be in the future. And so this is maybe the slight northernmost movement of a species range where that species currently isn't found, but maybe 100 kilometers north to where we expect that species range to be a bit more adapted as climate warms. And there are examples of populations moving seed and fruit trees in the eastern US, American chestnut being one of these species that we look to as an example of one of those that's been, we see isolated populations that have been moved around over long time periods. And then the last example would be assisted species migration. This is more of the extreme end of things, and I won't be talking too much about this, but it's just an example of how there are different types of assisted migration. The example here is assisted species migration. This is really the translocation of exotic species, intercontinental movement of Norway spruce into New England or red oak into Europe. And while there are examples that they may be climate adapted, this really, I think, gives many ecologists and biologists a little bit more hesitation given the risk of invasion. Now, again, there are some examples of this, but we won't be using that today as an example of climate adaptation in our work. And so, as Tony mentioned, we have an ongoing experiment titled the Adaptive Silviculture for Climate Change project. This is an international experiment where scientists and managers have come together to co-develop and design an experiment that is operational scale. So this is at a scope that is representative of forest operations for the region and really localized among different ecosystems. And so you can see different pins across the US and Canada, where this common framework of resistance, resilience, and transition has been applied. And so today I'll be talking and really focusing on our site, the Second College Grant in northern New Hampshire. This is a northern hardwood site, and really honing in on the role of chestnut in the transition treatments there. But as Tony mentioned, we've replicated versions of this RRT treatment, both in the adaptive silviculture site as well as 7 other sites, as well as some smaller scale experimentations in various research forests throughout the Northeast region. So while I'll be presenting on some of the results from the ASK experiment, we also have anecdotal evidence from a number of our other plantings throughout the region. And you can see these sites relative to the approximate location of historic Little's range of American chestnut. So many of these are starting to push the envelope in terms of that range expansion. And so what we're looking at here, this is just a aerial image of the treatment design of the second college grant ASK experiment. So there are 4 replicated treatments. Again, this is being an experiment, but also of an operational scale. So each of these treatment areas is around 25 acres, where different forest management actions have been applied across the different treatments. And then so within our transition treatment, recognizing that many of these planted species require higher light requirements, we've created various gaps scale harvests of around a 1/4 acre all the way up to an acre in size, and these have been planted with a suite of species. And so we're planting and testing various species selected from different functional traits, but you can see that I've coded them based on their assisted migration classification. So the first 6 species we call assisted population expansion species. These are those that are currently on site or within range, maybe making up a lesser proportion of the forest composition, but we're planting genotypes or seedlings from a seed source that maybe is a bit more climate adapted. And then there are 3 species, including B3, F3 American chestnut, that we would classify as range expansion. They're not currently on site, but under warming conditions, we anticipate those ranges to increase and encapsulate that region. And so in anticipation of that, planting those species. And again, Tony spent a bit of time talking about the role of functional traits and redundancy. And so while we use climate change trialis and various models to select many of these species, considerable emphasis was placed on the functional traits and think about the redundancy of these species as we selected them for testing and implementation. And so taking a bit of a look at the role of chestnut assisted migration on our second college grant site, you can see this conceptual diagram. This is total fitness of a seedling or a plant. So fitness could be survival, it can be growth, it can be other measures of performance versus latitudinal transfer. So this would be northern transfer of a seed source. And so generally, it's accepted that a few degrees of northward and southern transfer of a seed source can lead to generally acceptable levels of performance without a precipitous decline. So 1 to 2 to 4 degrees of latitudinal transfers. Each degree of latitude is around 100 kilometers. And so a few degrees is generally accepted as tolerable. And we can see that in this figure here that within the Northeast, we have American chestnut historic range within 100 kilometers. And so that should be pretty acceptable. And so when we look at that range relative to where those seed sources are coming from, in terms of a range shift, we're talking about a 1 degree shift. So that it seems to be pretty appropriate. The problem being the seed sources that we're able to test are coming from Virginia down at the Meadowview farm. Many thanks to Kendra for supplying these, but we're really starting to push the envelope in terms of that seed transfer distance. This is around 12 degrees in terms of latitudinal transfer, or around 1,200 kilometers from that seed source to this northern New England site. So we're really curious, how do these seed sources perform when they're really pushed in terms of their climate envelope? So just a bit of a look of taking a view of what this looks like on the ground. We have over 5,000 seedlings planted. I guess a 1/9 of those representing American chestnut. Each of these are pin flagged and coded throughout various gaps. These are replicated, and we've monitored these. The results I'll be presenting on today are up to year 4, but at this point we're into the 8th growing season of these seedlings. And so you can see by year 2, a little bit of that natural regeneration coming in. Year 3, quite a bit more in terms of that growth. In year 4, our large seedling field technicians are being swallowed up by that natural regeneration. And so the work that I'll be talking about today was published in Forest Ecology and Management. So for those folks who are interested, by all means, go check out this article. But just a quick view at some of these early outcomes. So again, we're looking at 4-year outcomes. Interesting to project that forward as the forest matures. But what we're looking at here, these are 2 different figures. Top would be % survival and the bottom would be growth. We have 4 seed sources, 2 clapper American chestnut B3F3 and 2 grave sources. And this refers to that original parent American chestnut of the back crosses. And then we also have grouped our other seedlings in terms of population expansion species and range expansion species. These are assisted migration types. And so some early takeaways that we see here is that in general, our population expansion species are faring better than our range expansion species. We would think that would be the case. But remember, American chestnut here is classified as a range expansion species within our group. And what we're seeing is overall pretty high levels of survival of American chestnut relative to both those population expansion species, which we would think to be pretty well adapted, or at least conceivably better adapted to these sites, and quite a bit higher in terms of statistical significance, American chestnut survival relative to those other range expansion species. In terms of growth, that it seems like that genotypic difference plays a bit of a role in terms of that overall performance, but we are seeing pretty strong growth response from our American chestnuts. And I'll go into a little bit more of detail in terms of that growth response in a second, but when we look at the species level performance and we rank them by % survival and growth and combine both of those measures, overall what we find is that, yes, our population enrichment expansion species, white pine, spruce, oak, hemlock, aspen, cherry, they tend to do pretty well, and they're faring quite a bit better than our range expansion species. But of those range expansion species, American chestnut's faring second rank. So pretty well relative to many of the other species. And we attribute that to the ability of American chestnut to resprout from disturbances. We've had quite a bit of early spring drought, which has culled many of our smaller size species during planting. We see quite a bit of a rapid growth response to any disturbance, whether it's frost injury or other aspects that are afflicting chestnut. And we also have a lack of chestnut blight. Now, granted, these are B3F3 with some level of resistance. This is playing a little bit of a role. Again, this is early results, and so we wouldn't see that for maybe a few years down the line, but another factor to consider as we start projecting how these seedlings will grow into saplings and to the overstory. One of the big factors that we think about, particularly as we think about maybe transitioning in the ecosystem, is how does the site responding to our efforts to transition the ecosystem by incorporating new species and new genotypes? And one of the ways we think about this is we frame it as ecological memory. And this is really the informational or material legacies on the sites, the seed that are in the seed bank from the natural seed sources, the stump sprouts from those stumps that have been cut. And what we're seeing is that, yeah, this is a northern hardwood site, and that hardwood site wants to stay northern hardwood. And so there's quite a bit of a strong competition response in terms of vegetation competition that can ultimately overcome and reduce the performance, growth, survival of our planted seedlings. And so the figures that we're looking at here are in the gray bars. These are American chestnuts. And overall, what we're seeing relative to different levels of competition, those seedlings that are under even intermediate or some levels of competition are actually growing and performing quite well. Under more suppressed and heavy competition, we certainly are seeing lower levels of survival and growth, understandably. But when we again compare those to, the blue would be our population expansion species, and the red bars, red box and whisker plots would be the range expansion species. American chestnut is still faring quite well and is able to respond and hold its own as we attempt to incorporate it into a northern hardwood system. Now, I have mentioned the role of seed transfer and these seed sources coming from quite a bit farther south. And one of the biggest afflictions we're seeing is that these specific seed sources are maladapted to the extreme cold temperatures that we get in northern New Hampshire. And so what we're seeing is that with an increase in the proportion of stem that is injured in terms of we're seeing a wilting of the stem and those seedlings ultimately dying back. Ultimately, that growth is being reduced on some of our seedlings. Still, we are seeing a pretty strong growth response. So despite being frosted and wounded by winter injury, we are seeing quite a bit of a strong growth response from American chestnut. It shouldn't be a surprise to those enthusiasts out there who know American chestnut well, but still, this has created a bit of a bushy trait and characteristic in terms of those seedlings. And so I'll be curious to see how that growth response translates over the next 10 to 20 years as canopy closes. Are these seedlings going to be able to continue be maintained within the landscape? And so one way that this can be refined is through perhaps a more closely adapted seed source. And so we know that many of the challenges of this is that for American chestnut, many of the germplasm studies and are more centrally located to where American chestnut's core ranges, but we are seeing great advances in terms of collections from Maine and southern New England. And so hopefully as those come online, we'll be able to incorporate a more climate adapted, conceivably more climate adapted genotype. Still, we are seeing these seedlings still able to maintain and grow and keep their own on the landscape. I think the final point that I want to make around seed collection, and this is from some work that we did, we looked at a whole suite of species, including American chestnut, is that as we think about a system migration and planting for various seed zones, one of the things that we find is a bit of a challenge is the nursery capacity and where those seed sources are coming from. So just an example, northern red oak is one of the most commonly collected and propagated deciduous tree species in forest nurseries and is widely available throughout the northeastern region. But despite this, we're still seeing quite very few seed sources being represented in forest nursery inventories. And so if our goal is to be able to plant under various climate conditions to be able to match the climate of the future, ultimately increasing our capacity, both in terms of the seedlings that are produced in nurseries, but also where those seeds are collected from to ensure that we're capturing various climate conditions of the future. So some broad takeaways from this talk, and particularly around chestnut, our efforts to both restore as well as incorporate chestnut as a assisted migration show quite a bit of promise, particularly in our region. Yes, we show that one of the greatest afflictions is that they are maladapted to these extreme cold conditions, but this can be improved with improved seed selection, as well as over time, if these seedlings are maintained and can establish roots in these systems, as those conditions warm, they may be able to be maintained and serve as a future seed source for future seedlings on site. We are able to incorporate chestnut and to sustain many of these culturally and ecologically important functions on site. As Tony mentioned, incorporating chestnut to support functional redundancy, that food source, as well as its ability to be able to grow and maintain high amounts of biomass. And so as we think about sequestering and storing carbon out of the atmosphere, it actually is this unique tree in that it has high carbon mitigation potential. I think the last point is that I'd like to make is that we can't necessarily plant our way out of climate change. It's exceedingly difficult to transition an entire ecosystem. And so in the context of assisted migration or even American chestnut, planting is the first step, but monitoring, tending, and examining how these seedlings perform as we move into different forest stages will be important to be able to understand the efficacy of system migration and adaptation. And then I guess I already mentioned this, but again, a blanket transition of an ecosystem remains a challenge. But if we are able to establish various what we call source nodes, so American chestnut that are adapted to the future, if we're able to establish them today, they'll potentially be able to serve as a future source node to be able to disperse throughout the landscape as our climate warms. And so with that, I'll close it out. Thank you for listening, and I'll pass the baton to Tim. And again, thank you all for the opportunity.
Pete and Tim, before we move over to Tim, I'd like to take a couple of questions in the Q&A. Would that be okay?
Yeah, sounds great. There's
some great questions in here. There we go. All right. Hal asks, when talking about seed transfer distance, it seems challenging to quantify for the B3F trees, what you all have been planting, sort of the more advanced hybrid chestnuts from the American Chestnut Foundation. Graves and Clapper, which is the underlying sources of resistance for a couple of our, for most of our lines, were from northern Connecticut, but future backcross parents were probably sourced into Virginia. And then he says that Sarah or Kendra might have insight into this. And I think, one thing to clarify there, Hal, is, some of our, that was the primary reason for the regionalization of the programming and for the chapter system within TACF was to take Graves and Clapper. They then got backcrossed onto trees from Virginia. Those then got backcrossed onto trees from across the range. And so we have trees from Maine all the way down to Georgia. And that's really what I think has been one of the primary outcomes of TACF's program to date has been just the accumulation of all this diversity into our programs, both in terms of what we call germplasm conservation orchards, or where we just plant wild type trees into a location, but also the backcross material has hundreds of backgrounds from across the range. Kendra, do you want to add anything onto that?
Yeah, sorry, I was actually just looking up. I know I had looked these up specifically for Pete. For what was planted, at least up at the second college grant. And we have, and I think this kind of gets at Carrie's question as well. There's 2 Clapper sources and 2 Graves sources. And I looked up the most recent wild type parent for both of those to get at any sort of differences in where they're located. And they're all from Smith County, Virginia.
Oh.
So relatively close to the research farm. Yeah. I think
that'll be interesting in the terms of that study.
Yeah, Buchanan Mountain, Bell Hollow, Quarter Branch, and Kirk Hollow. So different locations, but all I think within the same. Yeah. But as there's a whole litany of other things going on in the background before we get to those local to Meadowview, I assume, crosses.
Yeah, and there might be an elevational component to that. I remember looking into that. It's been some time, but I do know there's a bit of topography there, but I don't know if it's enough to make up a degree or more in terms of latitudinal transfer. Sometimes I think that elevational shift can help compensate. So we'll get higher elevation spruce from West Virginia, for example, to be incorporated into our.
All right, we've got another couple questions here. So Doug Boucher asks, Pete, in terms of legacy impacts, roughly how many of the low canopy species in year 4 were your planted individuals as opposed to regeneration of legacy species?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm not sure if I can totally answer the question. So we, specifically, we don't have American chestnut naturally regenerating on site. I don't think that's the question, though. We also we have a different way of quantifying, say, the natural regeneration that's on site from the seed bank and from root sprouts. And so we're not comparing, say, numbers of individuals of natural regeneration to numbers of individuals that we've planted. We're largely quantifying the individuals that were planted relative to, say, the surrounding conditions. How competitive are those conditions in terms of the natural regeneration? In terms of the number of individuals that survived by year 4 or even year 8 at this point, I should go back to that original figure that I was looking at, but it varies by species. I think cherry and aspen, we see some of the lowest levels of survival, and so we're talking maybe 30% relative to American chestnut. I'm zooming in on this figure, so just bear with me. Mean survival at year 4 was 72%, and I think we've probably lost a few percent from the chestnut. But yeah, I would say high 60s in terms of percent survival, even at year 8. We didn't, sorry, I think we're at year 7, I should clarify. But relative to white pine, oak, some of our other species, which are maybe closer to like high 80s, American chestnut's faring pretty well.
Great. Well, I hope folks might check out the Q&A. There are a couple of answered questions. I know, Tony, so if you click on that Q&A panel and go to answered, you'll see some of the conversation that's been happening there. I want to make sure we have enough time for Tim to give his talk. So I'm going to, hopefully we can circle back to some of the questions that are still in the Q&A. But thanks, Pete and Tony so far. Tim, if you would take it away.
Thank you very much, Sarah and Kendra, for showing this, including me in this presentation. I'm just going to share my screen here. So, can you see that presentation, Sarah and Kendra?
Yep.
Yes.
That's great. Yeah.
Great. Okay. Good morning. My name is Tim Stout. I live in Burlington, Vermont, but have a 175-acre former dairy farm down. Now it's mostly an experimental forest down in Shrewsbury, Vermont. So I'm not a scientist. I'm not a forester. My background, I worked in the corporate world for 35 years, designing energy efficiency programs for customer-focused efficiency programs for large utilities. And when I retired from that 6 years ago, I looked at our land and land across Vermont, recognizing that 80% of the forest in Vermont is owned by private landowners. So my goal after retirement was, how can our land and the surrounding watershed impact other landowners? What can we show works for adapting to climate change? So this is our farm is just below that the last field you can see in this picture. This is about 23,000 acres. Our property, along with our neighbors, is about 1,000. And this used to be almost all pasture, and then allowed to grow back, or did grow back in the early 1900s. So we have a pretty healthy forest. Lots of the main mixed hardwood, hemlock, balsam, and so forth. Just a couple of things. So this looks very healthy, but the climate impacts have been severe. We're expecting invasive plants. We have about 7 different invasive plants now, and a number of insects and diseases that are cruising in to damage this forest. So at Jockey Hill Farm, which is in Shrewsbury, Vermont, our goal is really to leave this land for future generations and learn from the experience we have implementing a number of these objectives. And a big call out to Tony and Peter for their input on how to proceed on with these objectives. But this gives you a general sense of what we're striving to do at the farm. The farm, very quick history, established around 1860. My family purchased it in 1942. It's now been visited by 6 generations. We have a conservation easement on it. We're enrolled in Vermont's current use program. So there's a lot of protection there. We're also involved in a forest carbon program. But really our view here is, what can we do, and then how do we translate our work to other landowners so we can share on our experiences. This gives you a sense of where we are down near Rutland, Vermont, where the farm is. So this slide is a little out of date, and there's some of these tree species that are not necessarily climate resilient. The oak acorns signify where oak forest was planted and where we have the American Chestnut Foundation chestnut seedlings growing in these fields. So our goal is to spread the species that we're planting across the farm so that we can potentially have the greatest impact. So I get a lot of questions, and amusing questions about if we have so much forest there and it grows really fast, and I don't have any statistics to show it or demonstrate this, but my sense are things are growing faster these days than they did, say, 20 years ago. So why are we planting these trees when there's regrowth, substantial growth? The main reason is that while we haven't been hit by woolly adelgid or EAB or other insects and disease, they're coming for us. So we watch this really closely. We have a lot of beech, a lot of hemlock, a lot of ash that are all susceptible to climate. Just a quick note on this picture in the upper right-hand corner, you see all those tree tubes. We've been planting trees. We've planted about 400 trees. We've got them scattered around the property. Those are just the white tree tubes that are protecting the trees we've planted. This is another field where we've done a planting and shows how concentrated the forest is around us. So one of our objectives was to get the family and neighbors and people around Vermont engaged in what we're doing. And we have had a number of family tree planting weekends. And the goal there is really to get buy-in from the family. I'm super passionate about climate change, about our forests, but the challenge is there are other family members who understandably don't really buy into it. So one of our major objectives is to try all sorts of ways to engage family and other landowners. Very kindly, the American Chestnut Foundation and Tony D'Amato for providing us with 50 American chestnuts. We have roughly, out of those 50, 42 trees still growing, and really impressive growth so far. I'm quite pleased, and we send our data annually over to Kendra for the Chestnut Foundation database. So very amusing story about Tony. He called me up about 2 years ago and said, Tim, I've got these hybrid American chestnuts. Would you have space to plant them? And I said, sure, we'd love to. So Tony appeared in a bright red pickup truck, and you couldn't see anyone driving it. It had 50 of those chestnut trees in the pickup truck in the cab, not in the bed because they blow over, but in the bed. And between all those chestnut trees, there was Tony bringing him down to the farm. We look at what we do at the farm as, all right, how wouldn't it be fun to really think about the future generations and what they can expect from the farm and what we can do to help preserve it. So 3 years ago, we planted 6 red oaks, and I'll explain to you why we didn't plant more, but they're doing surprisingly well. Abe is my grandson, who lives out here in LA. But the trees now mostly, they don't look in the picture, but those oaks are 78 feet tall in some cases. And then we switch over to the chestnut forest. Fee's my granddaughter. So we've got about right now roughly 42 chestnuts that are thriving. I'm really pleased at the growth that we've seen over the last couple of years. And this is one of our major priorities at the farm, is to see which of these trees survive. And why is it important that we do this? I've mentioned leaving the farm to future generations, where we see climate change as an imminent threat to our land, and some indicators of that. I was telling Peter and Sarah and Tony earlier, the impacts of climate change on our land in the last 3 years, the ramp up is significant. So we've had flash floods, we've had incredibly strong winds, a number of indicators, other indicators of climate change. So we're doing our best to adapt to that. We hope to be part of the solution. As I mentioned, we reach out to a lot of landowners and definitely have different field trips and events. I'm not a forester or a scientist, so whenever we do a field trip, I bring someone in who kindly is able to provide the expertise. So that's why our family is engaged. We really want to preserve it as much as possible. It's been a very interesting experiment planting trees. And as I mentioned, the last 3 or 4 years, we're seeing a huge ramp up in impacts. We have major erosion, major flooding, strong winds and the like, and then an occasional drought. But it's been humbling to see the amount of work that it takes to run these programs, and to, at the same time, adapt. And a good example is back in early May, I installed a couple of new culverts, thinking that I had doubled the size from what we thought we needed. In fact, we needed even more than double, because a couple of those culverts have blown out already this summer. Another goal, we've got lots of invasive plants. We right now are up to about 8. And we just had a Natural Resource Conservation Service grant to treat the invasive plants that are taking over, preventing regeneration in some cases. So our goal is to treat about a 30-acre piece of this land that has pretty high concentrations. The results, as I mentioned, the chestnuts are thriving. The red oaks, I was advised, we're at about 2,100 foot elevation. We have our own little microclimate, so the weather gets really nasty. But the oaks and the chestnuts are doing very well. The other climate resilient trees that we've planted, mixed results. So a lot of die-off, significant herbivory, and of course the challenge of putting fencing around all these plantings it's a major cost and effort on our part. In hindsight, I wish we'd focus more on, instead of adding every year, more on maintaining the trees that we planted. Our soils, we've had a couple of plantings where heavy rain has wiped out some of the trees that we planted. I mentioned herbivory and then disease that are coming for our trees. So this shows what we're doing at the farm this year. Invasive plant eradication over on the right, erosion control, riparian zone recovery. And those are all in quite a long list of efforts we're undertaking this year to continue what we put in place. A fun part of what we do is bringing other landowners there, as I mentioned earlier on, but we do about 4 or 5 either large or small field trips. And our goal is to get as many people out in the land and to really focus on central Vermont. The Chestnut magazine that Sarah, Kendra, and others published this article on what we're doing at the farm. And so it's in the spring issue of Chestnut magazine. And here we capture a lot of why we've planted these chestnuts and our objective. So that's the end of my slides. I'll go back a ways here and take us back to this photograph. So we have a lot of projects going on. Huge amount of our effort has gone into addressing the erosion that we have. That stream right in the middle, now the flooding has eaten away about 25 to 40 feet along the border. So the erosion is a major issue. So we're losing our soils. We're seeing lots of other impacts, a lot of tree blowdowns. So there's this threat. But my hope as a landowner, and recognizing that there's so many landowners play a considerable role in preserving what we have, how do we share what we're doing with others and what's inspiring to them? So I'll leave it at that, but I really, again, appreciate being part of this call. And my view is that there's definitely hope. We can get really down, particularly in Vermont, where we have these incredible flash floods. But there's a lot we can do as landowners to help preserve what we have. And our goal is to reach as many of those landowners as possible. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Sarah and Kendra.
Tim, fantastic. Thank you. This was one of my favorite Chestnut Chats at number 51. I mean, there's great things about all of them, but there was a comment in here. I hope that I can capture it appropriately. But Ron says, "Love this chat. It's a great mix of theoretical and applied information. Tim Stout's segment can inspire many of those who wonder if it's possible to do more than dream. Certainly a lot of work behind the restoration." So I think that really captures it. I love that comment. Thank you guys. I've got a couple questions. If you guys can handle a couple more. Let's head into the Q&A here. Jim Cartmel says, the real test is reproduction. Trees will live outside their natural range, but don't necessarily reproduce. This is a 10, 20, 30-year time scale from seed to mature tree is 1 seed in 100 to 1 seed in 1,000 plus. I like this, just not sure if it's relevant. I wonder if you guys have any comments to that comment.
Yeah, I think maybe I can take a jump at it here, and then maybe Peter, Tim might have follow-up thoughts on it. But I think one of the misconceptions of when we talk about this, and Pete mentioned, is that we're trying to replant the future forest and it's set, that and really the way we view whether it's the chestnut restoration or other plantings is that it's a component of a larger suite of actions we're taking to try to enhance the capacity, hopefully, of that forest to adapt over time. And so I always joke that in those, I know Carrie's in the call, she probably saw the survival numbers, and was going to type in the chat, never trust another word about reforestation from Tony or Pete, because those are 30-40% survival. I mean, you're going to lose your job, but for us, if 10% or 5% survive 50 years, when the climate continues to evolve and change, and our reproductive individuals at that point, all of a sudden there's an opportunity in that landscape that wasn't there without planting for, a seed source that is adapted to the site. And so I think, the way we look at it is, obviously we do despair over trees dying, and when we're moving them and planting them. But the idea is just to have these additional options for reproduction in those places that could kind of fill that role as the climate continues to evolve. And I think, to that point, a lot of the projections, even with the climate change tree atlas, we use that, quite a bit, often think of really 40 years out is when some of these major changes are going to occur that really do shift the habitat suitability. And so if those species survive to that point and can reproduce, even if a few of them, I'm excited about that as an option on the landscape. So I think it's true. Like, we want to be making sure that we're getting reproduction, not just, survival in those places.
Great. Thanks for answering that. Let's see. Susan Thompson has a couple of notes. She also says that Tim Stout is her new idol. But she says, have the chestnuts at Jockey Hill Farm sustained much frost damage? And she further says, I'm thinking about historically frost damaged American chestnut trees. may be more susceptible to blight. Any comment on that?
Yeah, great question. We did have a considerable frost in the spring of 2023, and it nipped a lot of the leaves that we had, but we were pretty bleak. But Kendra always steps in with suggestions, and I was concerned we were losing our trees, and Kendra said, no, they could bounce back, and sure enough, they all bounced back. And we treat them like our kids. You know, we make sure there's no competing growth around those trees. We fertilize them. We have significant fencing. So that's kind of where we stand.
Yeah, and just
Um,
to add to that, Tim, because we've looked at stem cold tolerance with chestnut a little bit. And yeah, frost damage to leaves is pretty common. It's really just a matter of, when those tender leaves are out, and we get a killing frost or a hard frost, which we did definitely have a nasty one 2 years ago, like took out a whole bunch of sumac too. They looked awful. But the stem dieback or sort of winter injury more so is sort of like dead stem tips, which does happen at the northern edge of the range, especially when the trees are young. But they seem to outgrow that issue. I haven't seen that be a vector for blight. Blight needs to get into the cambium. So, I mean, technically, if you have some damaged stem tissue, that could be a place for blight to get cozy. But typically those branch tips are kind of the skinniest part of the tree, and there's not a whole lot of risk there. So I haven't really seen that be kind of an increased risk for blight. That they're not super happy, but they handle it.
Yeah, if anything, you like having a compound disturbance can make them more vulnerable. But to your point, Kendra, it's not making them more susceptible. It's just lower photosynthetic capacity and the ability to be able to fight off blights or afflictions.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions. I really like Doug Boucher's question here. For all 3 of the great presenters, do you have any estimates of the cost per tree of planting, including the cost of the tree and the labor costs of planting and maintenance for the first few years?
As Tim mentioned, the cost of that fancy truck to bring the chestnuts to his house is pretty high. Yeah, so I mean, so much of our planting we do with research crews, and even like we do brush saw release work. So it's student or research technician labor. I can give estimates of cost per tree that are independent of the chestnut cost, because I think that there's a lot of the behind any nut, as you all appreciate better than me, in terms of the cost to get that to us. But we're tend to be averaging in the Northeast, which is very different than other parts of the East and certainly other parts of the country in terms of nursery capacity, as Pete mentioned. But we generally can get like seedlings, whether it's red oak, white pine, anywhere to a little, maybe 75 cents to $1.50 a seedling. So it's not, and that's for large lot sizes. So it's not as cheap as maybe some other areas, depend for conifers. Red oak as well, kind of similar price, again, depending on where we're getting it from. Then the actual planting cost. So we're paying students, but we did contract consultant firm to help with some of our planting, and we were kind of shocked by the cost relative to what I'm used to in larger reforestation. They're charging $7 per tree to plant, which maybe we want to change professions at the to planting trees, but not just in a research. But I think that just shows a limited labor right now for it, and so the price that can be paid for it, and again, often NRCS is doing a lot of that cost share on those planting projects for private landowners, but we tend to do competition control with brush saws on some of the trees for the first 3 to 4 years, depending on the productivity of the site. And so again, we're probably looking at another trying to bring down to a per seedling, I don't know, $1 or $2, if you kind of factor in like the cost of the day per seedling. So writ large, we're probably looking at $30 or so per tree, over a few year period to get it in the ground and kept happy by our crews. None of this, again, the Northeast, and not to keep laboring this, beyond like the lack of seedlings, we just don't have a lot of like crews that come through and do reforestation work or, you know, competition control work at scale. So probably cheaper in other areas where you actually have that as part of the workforce, although I know workforce issues exist across the country, but that's kind of what we're looking at. Tim, I don't know. I mean, that was all, how many brownies did we eat that day? That was the cost for
I just quick add on to what Tony mentioned. A big part of the cost for us is the ongoing maintenance. So we planted all the chestnuts in 2 fields, and the herbivory, if the moose don't get near them, the deer, we have plentiful deer. We've been really, really lucky, but keeping the competing vegetation down, buying mats for each of the trees to keep that vegetation down, number of other factors, it becomes quite expensive to keep them going. So if we just abandon them, I really question how well they'd survive. So we are up there quite a bit. I have someone I hire to help me out with that, but it's a labor of love, and the greatest thing is how rewarding it is to see these trees grow so fast, and then to think about the impact of the American Chestnut Foundation has had across the eastern side of the country, and bringing hope to landowners like me that we can partake in some of the work that people like Tony and Peter are doing, and Kendra and Sarah. So that's my story.
Well, that's fantastic. I think we're knocking on 1 o'clock here. There are a couple more lingering questions. Maybe we'll find a way to get everybody some answers to that here as we wrap up. But Tony, Pete, Tim, thank you guys. That was really fantastic, inspiring. Like it really. I mean, I've been doing this a long time, and this is one of the more inspirational talks. It definitely giving some hope. So thank you, Kendra. Thanks for helping arrange this. This was really great. Tony, you have any last?
I
Or
was just,
Peter,
I was just
Tim?
gonna thank you, you know, and thank
Okay.
Tim for, you know, really demonstrating what's possible. He's been a real influencer for us in the region, and yeah, to those that have just met Tim as your idol, many of us want to emulate him. He's a great partner.
All right, fantastic. Well, next month we are planning, so that'll be September 20th, I think. We have a Chestnut Chat. We're going to talk a little bit more about chestnut, the history of chestnut hybridization. We're going to have Mike Alcott is going to talk about the timber type program that was created by the Pennsylvania, New Jersey chapter. We're going to have John Scrivani talking about the programs that have taken place with Virginia Department of Forestry at Lausanne State Forest. We're going to have Jared Westbrook on to talk a little bit more about the recurrent genomic selection program that's being implemented by TACF. And that'll all be a way to pipeline in to excitement for everybody to come to Connecticut to see the trees at the Connecticut Ag Experiment Station. So you see how that all really, we wrapped it up there. A great segue for that. So you guys, thank you. Really fantastic. Hope our paths cross again in the future. Everybody have a great weekend, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thanks,
everyone.
guys.
Thanks, everybody.